Test, test. Is this working now? Much better. All right. Let's get this thing going. There I am. All right. Hello and welcome to another Monday afternoon or evening or morning, or depending on what time it is wherever you are. Another Monday office hours stream where I sit here and I talk about making music with Ableton Live. And you guys are more than welcome to hop on in and ask me questions about whatever it is you want to talk about when it comes to making music with Live. So yeah, that's what we're gonna be doing today. And I got a few things I want to talk about first. But before we get into that, I do want to just let people know that all of the live streams that I do are uploaded to the channel later on. And they used to live just on the videos page, but I changed that a little bit. So let me pull this up. This is what my YouTube looks like. So they used to all be on the videos page here, and then I've made them unlisted. And so, but you can still access them by either going to the playlist page, and then there's going to be a live stream playlist where that's where all the live streams are going to be. Or if you just go to the home page right here, there's going to be all the live streams right here in this little same playlist right here. So for some reason you are wanting access to any of the videos from previous live streams, you can go in there and access it there. I didn't want people to think I was deleting them and hiding them. All the live streams are available. They were just cluttering up the video page, and so I figured I'd make the video page look nice and clean for all of the content uploaded to the channel, and then live streams just live in their own separate little place. But if you like that system better or you like it worse, let me know, and I will see how people feel about it. All right, so I didn't really have anything planned for today. I was just going to kind of do a little of experimenting. I actually kind of want to play some reverbs and kind of see about using hybrid reverb as a return track and just see if I like it, if I want to keep it that way or not. So I might do a little sound design, a little playing with reverb, a little just kind of seeing what I can get out of it first, and then kind of go from there. What's up, Martin? How you doing today? Welcome to the stream. So yeah, so return tracks. If you guys are not aware of return tracks and how and why they're useful, check out my video I did on return tracks. I have been updating and playing around with my production template a little bit on a stream I did last Tuesday for the Patreon members. And I'm right now I'm using a bunch of third-party plugins for my return tracks, and I'm debating dropping some of the third-party plugins for hybrid reverb, because I really like hybrid reverb, but I'm not sure if it's better than the third-party plugins that I'm already using. Nice, awesome, good to see you, Martin. Isaac, how are you doing today? Welcome. So yeah, so hybrid reverb, fantastic device. In the newest beta of Live, the 11.1 beta, hybrid reverb is significantly less CPU intensive than it was before, which is fantastic because it was a little bit of a CPU hog. And this is not the beta that I'm using right now, but just know that they are continually shaving down the CPU cost of hybrid reverb. Machine of Loving Grace, that is a fantastic question. So the plugins that I use primarily for reverb are all made by Valhalla, and primarily it's Valhalla Vintage Verb and Valhalla Shimmer. Those are really the two go-tos that I just absolutely love and will stand by 100%. I've also been playing around with the FabFilter Pro R. I got that kind of recently, in the last 6 months, I guess, and it's pretty awesome. But I think the Valhalla ones are the way to go, hands down. But that being said, I do really like the hybrid reverb. So let's grab our little friendly piano guy. And I'm going to keep the reverb down on the piano. Why am I getting a feedback loop with that? All right, let's try that again. And let's just... Okay, that's better. All right, let us take something like this, and we're going to crank it through the hybrid reverb. I really like that. It's just kind of like a default setting. And what I want to do is really kind of figure out a little bit between like how much convolution I want to use versus how much algorithm, because I think they're both good. Yeah, username. Hit me with any of your EQ and compression questions. So if we were going to start with something like this, let's start with the algorithmic, because I think this is where a lot of the magic happens. And I'm going to set this to be monitored. It's still not going to work with my push. It's going to be annoying. All right, let's see what this question is. Okay, so this is a fantastic question. So is there any really advantage to using a third-party compressor plugin, or is the Ableton stock compressor ever as good? Not what you have, but how you use it. So yeah, I think that for the most part, in general, EQ8 and the live compressor can get you something that will sound just as good as nearly any third-party plugin. The nice thing about the live compressor and live EQ, there's the EQ8 and compressor. We're talking about, I'm assuming you're talking about both of those. If we're just talking about like stock versus third party, is they're really straightforward. They're really simple. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. There's not a lot of like crazy little extra bonuses you get. But that's honestly, that can be an advantage. Because there's not a million settings here, I don't need to spend tons of time tweaking all the settings here. I do think if I just like quick and dirty need something compressed, the live compressor works totally fine. You're not going to like hear a difference. Nobody's ever going to call you out and be like, oh man, that sounds like you're using the live compressor. Nobody can tell. It's basically impossible to tell the difference between that. However, if we compare this to like a plugin that I really like FabFilter Pro C, which is a fantastic third-party plugin compressor, you're gonna notice there's a lot more extra features in here. There's gonna be some extra settings you're gonna have access to, but most of it is gonna be exactly the same. And so this allows you a bit more control. This allows you to like dial in and like do some like different kind of sounding compression, for example, which is really nice. So you're gonna be getting more options with the third-party plugin. However, in order to make something with more options sound good, you're going to need to like know what all those extra settings are. So let's see if this makes sense. So third-party plugins, you get more options, which means it's more time-consuming, and you have to have more knowledge to make them actually get the benefit of using that, right? Whereas something like the live compressor, it requires less knowledge to make it sound decent or good, and it is very fast to use. So for something where I'm doing like, say I'm doing a track with a vocalist, and I really want to make that vocalist shine, I'll probably go in and I'll probably use Pro C. I'll go in there and I'll like just make sure I get everything just perfect the way I want. But if it's like I'm just producing a track and I just need to like compress, my kick a little bit, live compressor is totally fine. But in terms of being able to hear the difference between the two, I think, basically 99.9% of the population, actually 100% of the population, if you have similar settings on the third-party compressor versus the regular compressor, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. It's 100%, you know, the person using the compressor and not the compressor itself. People will say things like, there might be like certain third-party plugins where they like are designed to have like a analog sound or an analog feel or something like that. And there's people who have tons of different opinions about whether analog versus digital, whether there actually is a difference or whether it matters. But that might be one situation where you might want to use a more expensive, fancier third-party plugin, is something that can emulate a piece of hardware or something that can like give it that extra little bit of saturation or warmth, whatever that means. But yeah, personally, I don't use a lot of third-party plugins these days. I'm 85% in the box Ableton Live stuff, and occasionally I'll use plugins. And so, yeah. And part of the reason I stopped using plugins is because I was spending a bunch of money for something I used not very often and wasn't even that great. Yeah, Martin, that's a great point. Steve Albini said, I want to hear the sound of the instrument, not the sound of the processor. And with something like compressor, like what a compressor is doing is so subtle anyway, like you're not going to hear a difference between the two. As long as you're doing the same kind of compression. If you have similar threshold, similar ratio, similar output gain on two different compressors, good luck hearing the difference. They're basically going to be exactly the same. You know, similar attack, similar release, similar dry wet. They're going to be basically the same. IG17, I'll get to tuning samples in just a second. Yeah, I've talked to a bunch of people about hardware versus digital, and a lot of like, you know, people who have been in the recording industry for a long time are like swear by hardware and think it's, you know, super important and the most amazing thing, and you need it. And then there are other people I've talked to who are like, hardware is bullshit. It all sounds it all sounds the same. Like people say they can tell the difference, but who actually knows? But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But in terms of like functionality and like what this compressor can do versus what this compressor can do, we're going down to like some pretty narrow things. This has a nice visual feedback, which is kind of cool. But threshold, ratio, attack, release, side chaining, you know, dry wet, all the same settings. They're all the same thing. So it's more about, do you know how to use a compressor than which compressor did you use, I think is the bigger thing. But yeah, there are plugins that I love that, like, you know, I was just talking about reverbs, and like, you know, Valhalla Shimmer sounds amazing. You're not going to get that sound out of the live reverb. So in that situation, you know, the plugin can do something that the live one can't. Or for something like a compressor or an EQ, you know, Pro Q is a fantastic EQ. You know, this is a great EQ that's very visual, gives you lots of information, gives you lots of options. But like, you know, 95% of the things that you can do with Pro Q, you can do with the EQ8. They're functionally the same thing. There's a fantastic video that I found a long time ago where somebody compared the two on like a really technical level, and like they're basically the same thing, is what he found out. In terms of like, if you have an EQ curve at exactly 3000 hertz with a Q of whatever, and I do the exact same thing over here, this, let's get rid of this guy and get rid of this guy. Like this, if I was really precise about it, this and this are functionally the same thing. You can't tell the difference between the two of them. But Pro Q is really nice because, again, I get the really nice visual feedback here. I can see like pre and post EQ. I can see all the details and everything. So it's really nice for like visually understanding and processing what's happening. And that's one of the benefits of a lot of third-party plugins, is more visual feedback. Martin, unfortunately, I don't drink. Otherwise, I definitely would have a drinking stream. Like the feedback stream is, I would probably. And then IG17 was also asking, is there any difference between processing the mixed wave as an audio track or applying the same processing on the master track? Also a fantastic question. Let me get to yours one at a time. So you were asking about how to tune a sample without too much distortion. So there's two primarily ways to tune a sample. One would be to just pitch the clip up and down. So it depends a little bit on the situation and how you're going to be doing it. So if I have like a little sample like this guy, I don't know why it's only on one side of stereo field. I guess that's just the way it's recorded. And I want to tune this. There's the pitch control right here, right? So I can pitch this up or pitch it down. However, you are going to get different amounts of, it's not quite distortion, it's more kind of like artifacts. You get weird things that happen as you pitch up and down, where it sounds weird, right? The way you get around that, or the way you kind of deal with that, is in your warp mode. So there are 6 different warp modes in Live, and these are basically different algorithms for stretching audio. So, Beats mode, for example, works really great for beats, but it sounds terrible on other things. So in this situation, it sounds terrible, right? That's not what you want. However, if we switch out of beats mode to something like tones or complex, it's going to sound a lot better. Let's not go quite as high. Or we try complex. So much better, right? So, or Complex Pro also works really great for this. And so you can go decently far before you get a lot of like weird, glitchy artifacting. So that's technique number 1, is as you are changing the pitch of something, as you're tuning it up and down, try different warp modes. If you're going to be pitching it a lot, Complex or Complex Pro are going to be the ways to go. And that's going to sound a lot better. The other thing that you can watch out for is the farther you pitch something up or down, the more stretching and weird things it has to do. Therefore, the more that artifacting and weird stuff that's going to happen. So if you can all help it, maybe don't pitch super far in either direction. Just try to go, under an octave in either direction. And that should sound pretty decent. But the farther you go, the more kind of distorting and things are going to happen. The other way we can approach this is if you have a sample loaded up inside of Sampler or Simpler, more likely Simpler, as we pitch things up and down, you're not going to get the same glitching, specifically because this disconnects pitch and time. So now if I play something at a high pitch, it's going to play faster. Or, actually, let's turn that off. Or if I play at a lower pitch, it's playing it slower. So you can do the same thing in here. Actually, I didn't mention this in repitch mode. In repitch mode, you can speed it up and slow it down, and it'll just change the tempo, but you can't pitch it. But if we're in Simpler like this, playing a high pitch plays it faster, low pitch plays it slower, but you notice there's none of that weird glitching. It doesn't artifact like that. If you want it to maintain timing, you can turn on warping right here, which you can select any of the different warp modes. And now as you pitch it up and down, it will maintain speed, but it'll do the same kind of warping where it'll kind of stretch it either direction and hopefully prevent weird glitching and artifacting. The big thing is just don't use beats mode when you're pitching things up and down. That'll make all the difference in the world. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question in terms of tuning things and pitching them up and down. It can be a little tricky. Sometimes it's like a bit of a balancing act between being able to pitch things really far, but also maintain audio quality. Like sometimes you have to make compromises in one or both of those areas. That's a good question. If anybody is just joining us here, if you have any questions about making music with Ableton Live, feel free to just toss those in the chat and I will get around to it. Hey Dan, how you doing? So yeah, so same kind of thing if you're tuning like a kick drum or something like that. So if you have a kick, grab this one, this kick should be an F. So if I want to pitch it up or down, I could either play it pitched up or down, or I could pitch it up and down the semitone control here. Let me play it the right pitch. So yeah, so if you have it in here and warp is turned on, as you play it at a higher pitch or low pitch, it's going to play at the same speed. If warp is turned off, as I pitch up or down, it's going to speed it up or slow it down. So you're going to get less distortion if warp is turned off, and then more distortion, but maintain timing if warp is turned on. So yeah, depending on what you're looking for, try either turning warp on or off and see if that gets you closer to what it is you're looking for. That'll make a big difference. Sweet. So yeah, let me know also if you want me to talk more about that. What's up? Bonjour. So the other question you had was, when you are mastering, is there any difference between processing a mixed WAV file on an audio track versus doing the exact same thing on the master track? Fantastic question. And functionally, in terms of the end result, it's exactly the same. In terms of the process and how you go about doing your masters, there are a few things that I think are worth pointing out in the differences between the two. So I personally like to do it in a separate session on an audio track with the mixed WAV file. To me, that makes a lot of sense for a couple reasons. Number one, it allows me to do multiple versions of the same master. So I could have multiple tracks sitting in the range view with different kind of mastering chains on them, or I might have the first version of the master and I might duplicate it and have the second version. That way, if I want to go back to an earlier version, it's super easy to do. Whereas when you're mastering in your mix on the master track, it's harder to go back and have different versions along the way. So that's one big difference for me. I also like to master with reference tracks. And so I'll have, a couple tracks that are my different versions of my master I'm working on, and then I have my reference tracks down here, which makes it really easy for me just to solo reference track and then solo the track I'm working on and just go back and forth. The third reason is that when you are mastering in its own separate session, it feels like a different part of the workflow. So that way I'm not always jumping back and forth between mixing and mastering, which when I'm mastering on the master, I tend to do that a lot. I tend to start the master, go back, fix the mix, go back to the master, go back, fix the mix, and go back and forth a lot. So it helps me kind of divide those two stages of the workflow. And then the last reason I like mastering in a separate session is CPU. A lot of the time, by the time I get to the final stages of my mix, I got lots of tracks with lots of processing and my computer is struggling. So by bouncing it out as a WAV file and then mastering that in a separate session, it basically resets the CPU. So you mean, but processing the audio on a track and send it to the master, or first send unprocessed audio to the master and then processing there? It'll be the same thing, basically. I like to do my mastering chain on the track itself and not have anything on the master, but it'll be functionally, it'll be the same thing. You're not going to hear any difference between having your mastering chain on the track versus having it on the master. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. All right, gonna jump back to Dan here real quick, and then I gotta catch up with chat in a second. So Dan's been trying to get more organized. Made a few notes. Hold on, let me make this larger, hopefully. Dan, I'm not sure if I understand your question. You were trying to get more organized, so you made a few notes in various places, but now you can't find some of them. Is there any place to look to find them? What kind of notes do you mean? You were like taking notes on like how are you going to update your project? Or you made a few notes as in you like played some MIDI notes. Oh, in the info text. No, you're kind of just going to have to remember where you put them. There's not going to be any way to like have it come up, as far as I know. There's no way to like identify that. For those of you guys who wonder what he's talking about, I made a video about this a while ago where you can like right click on something and hit edit info text, and then you can like type in stuff in here. So here's my notes that I'm making. So you can type that stuff in there. And that way, when you mouse over this track, it'll, in the info view, tell you what it is. And he was asking if you forget where he puts those notes, is there a way to find them? And as far as I know, there's not. You just have to mouse over things. That's why if I ever do this, I only do it on like either, usually track names. So that way, like I know, like, okay, I mouse over this, there it is. The other thing that I do when I'm working in my template is I never use the color red, except for when I need to like work on something. So usually I'll color the track red, which indicates like this track needs work, it's not done, it's not finished, something's wrong with it. And then usually that'll be the track that will have the notes on it. So color code things when you take notes, and I think that'll probably allow you to hopefully remember where you put your notes. But other than that, I don't think there's going to be a way to like find them. Good question though. All right, so Martin is asking, not sure if relevant, but if you processing in the master, I think export affects the full master track though. It says export all these things. If you're processing on the master, I think export the effects in the full master track. No, so when you are exporting, if you are bouncing out stems, if you're like bouncing out all tracks individually, then I don't think they'll include what's on the master track. But if you're bouncing out the master, it should include everything on the master. And then username is asking about where to start learning fundamentals for mixing and mastering. Well, hopefully on this YouTube channel is a good place to get started. I haven't done a lot of videos on mixing and mastering, but I end up talking about it quite a bit on stream. But we can definitely talk about the fundamentals and where to go for it. I learned a lot about mixing and mastering just from talking and hanging out with other people who are super nerdy about mixing and mastering. That's really kind of where I picked up a lot of my resources on it. And then YouTube's okay. There's like YouTube for mixing and mastering is really hit or miss. Sometimes it's really good, and sometimes it's just totally a waste of time. Yeah, I think with we can talk about mixing for sure. That's part of the reason I'm really excited about doing the 50 song challenge, is that I'll have a bunch of just brand new stuff that I can use for examples for mixing and mastering on stream. And that way you can kind of see my process as I go through it. So that's part of the plan as we get closer to that. Ooh, IG17 is asking a really fantastic question. What do you think about Ableton's dither? Is it better than the L2 Pro, for example? Export my mix down in 4832 bits and then export the master in 441 24 bit. Or is it better to work and mix in 441 from the beginning? So a little bit about audio qualities and exporting and all that kind of stuff. So when we're exporting, we can choose what sample rate we want to export at, and we can choose what bit depth we want to export at. So depending on where you are in your process, I like to do this slightly differently. So the way Live works in terms of bit depth is that the actual channels in Live are 32-bit. So when you're just listening to Live, just audio coming live, it's in 32-bit before you do anything. So what this means for me personally, we were just talking about, mixing in your mix session, exporting the WAV file, and then you having that in your mastering session, right? So what I like to do is when I am exporting from mix to master, I'm exporting at 32-bit. Because like I said, it's already naturally at 32-bit. And then that way I get that single audio stereo file and it's 32-bit and it doesn't change anything in terms of audio quality. It doesn't reduce anything in terms of audio quality. As far as sample rate, I'll usually just leave it at 44.1. That's usually where I'm working, and that's usually where I just leave it. So 44.1 is totally fine. Then when I am done my master, I will export again, and that's when I'm going to do my dithering. So a mistake I made many years ago for a long time was I would export my master at 24 and then dither it, or export my mix at 24, dither it, and then export it again and dither it again. And you don't want to do that. There's no reason to dither twice. So when you're done your mix, export at 32. And that way when you're working on your master, it's in 32-bit. Great. And that way when you are done your master, you can go down to 24 and you can use, honestly, whichever dither you like the best. Honestly, I think Power 3, for the most part, for the kind of music that I make, works great. But honestly, I haven't done a lot of like A-Bing between rectangular, triangular, and Power 3. I think, honestly, any three of them will work. I have also not really compared the dithering in live to other softwares and other options out there. I usually think it's so subtle and it's so minor that I don't think it's gonna make a huge difference. But yeah, usually I'm working in either 44.1, 32-bit as long as possible, or 48K 32-bit as long as possible, and then I'm only dithering at the very end to go down to 24. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, I think the dithering extras are fine. I don't like this to be one of those things that I think you'd struggle to tell a difference between Power 3, triangular, and rectangular. I think any of this will work. Dan, are you asking if I'm nervous about the 50-song challenge? Not really, a little bit. I'm going to do basically a bunch of test runs. I'm going to basically starting 2 weeks from now till Christmas, I'm just going to do test runs. Like every week, I'm just going to run it and just going to see what I can do. And then I'll feel really good about it before I officially start doing it. So the high quality option, I'm assuming you're talking about, it's in here somewhere. Did I move this around? Did they get rid of it in 11? Oh, this cut. Yeah, so this, you can always leave on. Just keep it on all the time, and it's not really going to change anything. This is not going to change you to 48K or anything like that. This is just how Live reads your samples, if I'm not mistaken. So Dan, the reason you want to export in 24 at the very end, oops, is 32-bit files are just huge. That's basically the only reason for it. 24-bit files are going to be a much smaller and easy to use. And I've actually found that sometimes 32-bit is weird when people try to play it. Like certain software programs don't like playing 32-bit. It's probably mostly fine now. But years ago, 32-bit, some programs would struggle with. But the main reason is file size more than anything else. And most people, when they're looking to download songs, 24-bit is usually as high as they want to go. If you're in audiophile and you want to just like maintain audio quality, just keep it 32-bit when you bounce out your master. But most of the time, if you're downloading like high quality audio files off the internet, off of like Bandcamp or something like that, 24-bit is usually what they're looking for. Yeah, username, we can talk a little bit about mixing today once I kind of get through a few more questions, because I think that the biggest mistake I see a lot of people make when it comes to mixing is just overthinking it. Just like they try to get too technical about it, and I think a lot of mixing, there's a certain like less is more philosophy, a certain like hands-off philosophy to mixing that I've taken on that has made my mixes sound way better. A lot of times people just go crazy and over process everything, and then it sounds worse than it did before. So we can talk about some techniques and approaches for mixing. I should probably do some more videos about it. Maybe for next week, I'll make a video about techniques for approaching mixing, or techniques, more like the philosophy for approaching mixing. Ganya, how are you doing today? Did your track get released officially, or is that next week? What do you think about live jamming, and what tools do you use for this? For example, jam a group of 4 people online. That's a fantastic question. I haven't done a lot of online jamming with people in live, so I probably won't have the best answer for you. I think that what I've generally done before is just done live jamming with people in person with different computers, in which case Link is really kind of like, that just solves all your problems right there. I'm not sure. I don't think you can send a link over like the internet. I think you have to be on the same Wi-Fi or the same network to get Link to work. But if you can get in the same room with somebody, use Link. That's going to be your best option. Other than that, I mean, I think listen to, that's really kind of like the bonus of listen to, is it's like it's pretty fast in real time, so you can like listen to each other. So you can be playing one thing and then send them a signal with listen to, and then they send you a signal with listen to, and that could work for live jamming. And then you both just record on your own individual computers. Other than that, and probably just like send your metronome out through listen to. Other than that, I think I'm not sure what people are doing. I know that Mixed in Key has their collaboration software that I have not yet tested out. Maybe what it's called. Yeah, this is, they're called the satellite sessions or satellite plugins. This is something that I know that they've been working on a bunch and has made a lot of progress recently. And so I have not tested it out myself. I think I have the license for it, though. I should probably try it out. It seems like a cool concept because you can use it as a plugin, and then it syncs with other people. And yeah, maybe I'll test it out on stream sometime. But this is kind of what it seems like a lot of the direction things are going for collaboration and doing online stuff together. So if you haven't tried this out, try it out and let me know what you think. I'm gonna go ahead and just, I'm gonna download this guy and maybe I'll try it out and I'll give you the official review on it. Boom, that's another idea for a video topic. It's been great. It's always hard to like brainstorm video topics. IG17 says, I saw a technique where you send your signal to return track, but affects the general signal. I mean, it doesn't act like parallel processing. In the video, there's a reverb to wash out the lead. Interesting. Maybe describe that a little bit more in detail for me. So you send your signal to a return track, but it affects the original signal. Yeah, I guess IG, I'm not quite understanding exactly what you're asking or what the technique involves. So also, I just want to let people know, if you are just joining us, feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat, and I will let you know. Also, if you are enjoying the stream, feel free to hit the like button, subscribe if you're not, all that kind of jazz. But IG, there's like a bunch of cool, interesting, weird signal processing things you can do with your return tracks in terms of like sending your signal to different places and kind of processing it in lots of different ways. All right, let me get rid of that guy. I think I can get rid of that guy too. You guys have had great questions so far. And I think I got to everybody's questions. If I skipped you or I didn't see it, just let me know again. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with chat. What's up, Josh? How you doing today? Yeah, IG, send me a link to it. I don't know if you can't put links in the chat, but you could send it on the Discord or something like that, and I can check it out. Yeah, Ganya. So I definitely wouldn't mind doing that. That might be the kind of thing, because it's a little bit more involved and more personal. That might be like a Patreon kind of thing where people send me their projects and I like open them up and take a look at it. But I definitely wouldn't mind doing. I mean, that's kind of what the song feedback streams are a little bit, but I'm not actually looking at their projects. Oh, nice. Good luck with that, Josh. So earlier, I think username was asking about mixing and how to get started with mixing. Like, how do you just like ground floor, entry level, like how do I actually get a mix that sounds better than when I started? Which I think is a fantastic question. And I think there's a lot of bullshit surrounding mixing. So if you guys don't mind, I might just do a little rant about just kind of mixing in general and where to get started with it and how to like kind of wrap your head around mixing and how to make a good mix. Let me see if I actually have an example of a track that we can pull up to get started. A lot of my songs are either all the way mixed or are not close to being ready to be mixed yet. So I want to find something that's like kind of in that mix range. All right, let me see if I can pull up something from a while ago. I wrote this on a different computer, so hopefully plugins work. All right, give me a moment while this loads. We'll see where we're at with it. So mixing, I think, is really confusing because I think a lot of people just aren't really clear about like what actually makes a good mix, what actually constitutes a good mix. I'm just missing an OTT and a trash. That should be fine. Maybe not. Hopefully, let's see how much work the OTT is actually doing here. This is Let's see what this sounds like. Oh, and I guess the drums are missing too. Let's see if we can find the drums. I'll give this a second. Great. It seems like we found most of them. All right, should be back. Should be good to go. All right, sorry about that. That's part of the reason I have not really been able to talk a lot about mixing on stream is because my mixing sessions tend to be a lot bigger, which freaks out my microphone whenever I'm streaming. So definitely let me know if the microphone keeps doing that, in which case we might just need to talk about mixing rather than demoing out a whole bunch. But that's just what happens. So the big thing about mixing is I'm gonna try to just go over some like real basic, real general stuff, hopefully to get you kind of like up and running when it comes to mixing. Number one is that when you're mixing, most of the heavy lifting that you're doing is being done by volumes. Just by adjusting volumes and understanding volumes as being something that is relative, right? So the way we understand sound and the way we hear sound is that the louder sounds, our brain naturally gravitates towards those sounds. It's just like it's a natural survival thing. If you're like in the jungle and you're being chased by a saber-tooth tiger, loud sounds need to be paid more attention to than quiet sounds. That's just how it works in our brains. So we can take that knowledge and we can use that to understand that when you are, taking a song like this that has a bunch of layers, that has a bunch of things going on, if we want something to be heard and be more present and be more noticed by the audience, we make it louder. If we want something to be more of like a supporting sound or something that's kind of in the background a little bit, we make it quieter. And that concept, which sounds really, really simple, totally changed the way I mix. It allows me to like just close my eyes. Like anytime you're mixing and you're like, I don't know what to do here. I'm just lost with this mix. Where do I even go? Close your eyes and just listen to the song and think about what's grabbing my attention. What are the sounds that my brain is focusing on? Those will usually be the loudest sounds in your song. What's up, Emo? How you doing? Talking a little bit about mixing. So the experiment and the thing you should do is both for songs you're mixing as well as for songs that you like, your reference tracks, just songs that you think are mixed really well. Close your eyes and identify, where's my brain going first? What is my brain paying attention to the most? Okay, and then what's the second sound my brain pays attention to? And then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, going from top to bottom. And see if you can identify every individual sound in that song. And then ask yourself the question, if it's your song that you're mixing, is that the order of importance for these sounds? Because depending on the style of music you're making and what kind of genre it is, there's going to be a different order of importance, right? if you're making dance music, EDM, any kind of dance music, the most important thing in your mix, the thing that people need to hear more than anything else, is the kick drum. Almost all the time. Because if no kick drum, people don't know how to move their bodies, which means they can't dance to it. So your kick drum needs to be nice and clear in the mix. So you can take that knowledge and take that information and just make sure, like, okay, make sure your kick is very loud and very present in the mix, right? Then you have to think, okay, what else is important in my mix here? If you're making a track with vocals, vocals are probably just as important, if not more important than the kick, depending on the style and what you're doing. So usually vocals also need to be like way up there in top priority. And then like, what's the next most important thing there? Again, depending on the style of dance music you're making, it's probably going to be the snare drum and or the bass line. Maybe bass line first and then snare drum right after, or roughly the same. And then what's the next most important sound? Well, maybe it's your chords, or maybe it's your, it's probably your chord progression or your melody. If you're making really melodic styles music, the melody is probably a higher level of importance. There's basically like there's a hierarchy of sounds, unfortunately, when you're making music. And the way you can enforce that hierarchy is just by turning volumes up and down. So you can emphasize your kick drum more by turning it up, or you can de-emphasize it by turning it down. And so a lot of times what I'll hear in mixes is I'll hear like things like hi-hats, for example. Hi-hats are going to stick way out in your mix. Number one, because they live in this really high frequency range and they don't have a lot of competition. So turn your hi, like I'll hear that all the time whenever I'm giving like the feedback on feedback streams. A lot of times percussion ends up being like way too loud. And it's not that like the percussion's bad or I don't want to hear it, but like if I can hear the percussion, if I close my eyes and percussion is grabbing my attention more than the kick drum or the bass line or the vocals, that means it's too loud. So just by doing this as an exercise to both your own mixes and your songs that you are making, but also songs that you like, pick out your favorite songs and try identifying every single sound individually and kind of seeing what's the most important, what's less important, and what's the least important. And that way you kind of know context. If you're making like country music, the order of importance, the hierarchy for your sounds is going to be totally different, right? So if you're making, country music, vocals, number one thing by far. If you can't hear the vocals, the song's not going to work. So make sure those vocals are really nice and loud. And then after that, probably guitar or melody, second most important thing. After that, probably the chords. After that, probably the drums a little bit. And then after that, probably the bass. So it's going to depend a little bit. Yeah, so this is purely for just kind of like figuring out how loud things need to be. So one of the very first things I'm going to do, and the reason I'm telling you guys this, is when I'm doing my first round, my first draft of mixing, first thing I'm going to pay attention to is the volumes. And just get my volumes roughly where they want them to be. And the way I'm going to do that is by doing just relative mixes. So I'm going to go in and, again, I'm worried about my CPU overloading as I'm streaming. But like I'm going to solo the kick and then listen to the kick, and then I'm going to listen to the kick with the snare. And I'm going to make sure my volume of my kick and my volume of my snare sound kind of roughly where I want it to be relative to each other. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my hi-hat. I'm going to do my kick, my snare, my hi-hat, make sure they all sound good together. And then for all the rest of my percussion. Dan, that's a fantastic question. So he's asking, what is a reference track? A reference track is literally just a track that you like that is somewhat in the same style or genre of the track you're making. So it's basically, it's a way to kind of identify like if you're on the right path or not. So for example, a reference track when you're mixing, if you're trying to you're listening to all your songs, listen to all your sounds individually, and you're like, I can't tell, is my kick too quiet or is my kick too loud? You could just check out your reference track and just A, B, and go back and forth and see like, oh, their kick sounds way louder than mine, which means I can make mine louder. So it just gives you an idea to kind of give you some context for where you are in your mix. I usually don't use a lot of reference tracks for when I'm mixing, but when you're mastering, reference tracks are basically mandatory. If you're mastering without a reference track, I think you're probably just doing it wrong. So that way, as you're mastering, you can kind of get a sense of like, okay, am I on the right path? Am I not on the right path? Does it sound good? Does it sound like shit? Having a reference track is really, really handy. Yeah. Even having reference tracks when you're producing can be really helpful. For like, I don't know, what tempo I should be at. Check out a reference track. It's really helpful. So yeah, so I'm going to be doing basically submixes where I'm going to basically take all of my drums and I'm going to make sure all my drums sound good relative to just my drums, just the other drums. And then I'm going to go to all my bass layers. And then I'm going to mix all of my bass layers good relative to just my other bass layers. And then I'm going to go to all my synth layers and make sure all my synth layers sound roughly good compared to all the other synth layers, essentially. So that's going to be one of the very first things I'm going to be doing is just submixes on each one of my groups or each one of my kind of like categories of sounds. And then I'm going to be, once I do that, then I'm going to compare my drums to my bass, make sure they sound good roughly relative to each other. And then I'm going to compare my bass to my synths and make sure they sound roughly good together. And then I'm going to add my drums and make sure they sound roughly good together. And just try to get everything roughly where I want it to be in the mix in terms of that hierarchy of sounds. Hopefully that makes sense. That's going to be like my first step when I'm approaching a mix, is just rough draft volumes kind of where I need to be. One thing I'd like to point out when it comes to mixing is headroom. This is really, really important. I see a lot of people, so if we're talking about the term headroom, headroom is the amount of space you have between your maximum volume on your master and 0 dB. So in this track, if I just play this, and hopefully it doesn't, let me know if it overloads and my mic gets messed up. Like that. Let's see if that, I have a feeling it messed up my microphone. Did it mess up everything? No, the microphone's fine, but it didn't play the sounds. All right. The joys of streaming with lots of audio stuff going on. All right, let's try this again. All right, so if we're talking about headroom, we take a look at the master right here. I've got 3.7 decibels of headroom, which means the space between my loudest part of my song and 0 dB is about almost 4 decibels. This is especially important when it comes to mixing, because if I have basically everything at 0 dB, if everything is turned up all the way, did you hear the music the second time? Let me just double check to make sure that works. Yeah, you should be able to hear that. Sometimes it's hard to tell when chat is delayed and how much I'm delayed and how much chat is delayed. Yeah, so the more headroom you have, if my kick drum is as loud as I can get it, and I still need more, my kick drum is up here, and I'm like, I can't go any louder. That means you need more headroom. And the way you do that is you turn all of your other tracks down. You turn everything down. So let me do this. I'm gonna select one of my tracks, select all of them, turn them all down at the same time. Now I've got 12 decibels of headroom. So if I have 12 decibels of headroom and I need more kick, I can turn the kick up where I need it. So as you're doing your rough mixes, as you're doing your kind of like relative volumes, getting places where you need to be, make sure you start with lots of headroom. I like to start with -12, as Emo mentioned. -12 decibels is a great place to get started for headroom. Don't use the utility on the master track. I mean, I guess that kind of works. I wouldn't recommend using utility on the master track. Turn down tracks together on the the actual tracks themselves. Definitely do not turn this down. I've seen a lot of people do this. We're like, okay, I need more headroom. I turn this down here. This actually reduces your bit depth. Don't do this. And I'm assuming that using utility on the master is going to be roughly the same. Although there might be a slight technical difference between a utility on the master versus the actual master output here. So turn down the tracks individually, or do what I do all the time, which is Command A, select all your tracks, and then I can move them all together. And that way they maintain their volume relative to each other. So that's really important. That should be fine after party. Yeah, it's just the volume control. Don't touch the volume on the master. So get your relative volumes where you want them. If you're having issues getting your relative volumes where you want them, make sure you have plenty of headroom, and that way you can turn things up to be louder and turn things down to be quieter, and you have room to go either direction. If you don't have any headroom, you can only turn things down, which makes your life more difficult when you're trying to get your volumes where you want them to be. So hopefully that makes sense as like a kind of starting point. And a big chunk of what I'm going to be doing when I'm mixing is just getting these volumes kind of where I need them to be. Once your volumes are, roughly where you want them to be, then your life as a mixing engineer becomes a lot easier. Because from there, you can start honing in more on details and kind of really dialing things in. All right, so that's kind of stage one of mixing. Relative volumes. It sounds really simple, and it sounds like kind of like, yeah, of course, but like it makes all the difference in the world. Yeah, Josh, as far as like, doing things with the master, there's lots of people who are like very much no, never put anything in the master ever until you get to mastering. I honestly think it's fine as long as you know what you're doing. But the big thing for me is just don't touch the volume coming out the master, because that will reduce your audio quality. Not by much, but it'll still do it. Okay, so once I've got volumes kind of roughly where I want them to be, kind of relative to everything else, the next major stage for mixing is going to be EQing. EQing is going to help do a lot of work for us. All right, so for example, I don't know if I've mixed this at all. It's been a long time. This one's kind of already EQ'd, but we'll test this one out. We're going to use this track as an example. In fact, we'll just do this. All right, so if I solo this track right here, which is kind of like a weird, annoying synthesizer with a bunch of reverb on it. The first thing I'm going to do when I'm EQing before I do any of my detail-oriented work, this is really big for me in a lot of cases for both production and for mixing. Start with the big picture ideas first, and then work your way towards details. Don't worry about doing like tiny little minor EQ adjustments during the first round of EQing. That's once you get the major work done first. This is why I'm focusing on the big picture ideas. So for example, if we listen to this guy right here, it sounds cool, but you may notice there's a bunch of low frequency information down here. What we're actually hearing is going to be this spike in volume right here. That right there. That's the actual sound we're hearing. Everything else that is underneath it is a lower frequency, is completely unwanted and unneeded. You just don't need it there. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply low cuts to everything. So there are two different kinds of low cuts in EQ8. There is the 12 decibel per octave low cut, and there is the 48 decibel octave low cut. This is what we want, the 48 decibel one. Essentially, obviously hopefully you guys know how an EQ works. In case you don't, it's just going to turn down any frequency. This blue line is basically going to be how much it's turning down by. So what we're going to do is we're going to start this down here. We're going to listen to it. And I'll move this up here. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to move it as far to the right as I can without it actually affecting our sound. So you'll notice as soon as I go a little farther to the right, here it's actually affecting the sound. Here it is not. So I'm going to move this as far to the right as I can. And what's happening here is these are a bunch of low frequencies that are completely pointless. They're completely useless. We don't want them. We don't need them. And when we just listen to one track, this and this should sound exactly the same, more or less. They sound a tiny bit different, but basically no change to the sound has happened. The issue here that I've found is that, well, not that I found, that mixing engineers for many, many years have found, is that when we just have one track like this little bit of low frequency information in here is not a big deal. But if I have 30, 40, 50, 60 plus tracks, and then they all have this low frequency information on it, that all adds up, and that creates what is known as mud in a mix. Some people are like, oh man, your mix sounds too muddy. Most likely what they're talking about is you got a lot of these unwanted low frequencies that are basically individually not a big deal, but when you add them up across multiple tracks, they just take up a lot of space in your mix and make it really hard to hear, especially your low end. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take our EQ8 and basically do what I just did here. Filter out anything that is below your fundamental. So you're looking for that spike in volume, and just get rid of it. And that's all you need to do. It's really like, it only takes a minute. Just you have to do it for basically every single track. But all of a sudden, you're going to find a lot more room so you can actually hear your low end, your kick, your bass, your things that are going to be living down in those lower frequency areas. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is mix tip number 2. After relative volumes is low cuts across the board. It'll make a big difference. Let me just catch up on chat for a second. Yeah, Ema, there's so many ways you can route things around inside of Live or whatever software to make different combinations of how you're gonna like sum up all your stuff. So all right, hopefully the audio is back. Check 1, 2. Okay. I do not know what's causing that. It's driving me nuts, and I really wish I could figure it out. But yeah, so what I was talking about was low cuts across the board as just a way to just clear up your mix. Super easy technique that makes a huge difference. The other thing that really kind of helps my approach to doing a mix, now I'm using a microphone into my audio interface, and then the audio interface is going into OBS, and then OBS is sending to YouTube. It's weird because OBS is fine. The audio is still going to OBS just fine. It's somewhere in between OBS and YouTube is the issue. So I've been trying to figure out forever, and I cannot figure out. I know what causes it, and I know how to mostly avoid it. But I'm not sure where what the missing link is. So yeah, so the way I like to think about mixing, or the thing that helped me change the way I approach mixing, is to think about mixing like a competition between different frequencies. So if you have certain sounds that live in a frequency zone where nothing else is there, it's usually really easy to make them sound clear. The issue arises when you have lots of frequencies that are in the same frequency range. Usually the 100 to about 2000 hertz range is where a big chunk of the audio content for your song is going to live. So that's usually where you have to do a lot of the most intense mixing in terms of EQing things to get them out of the way, as well as doing things like panning. Things that live in the very low end sometimes can be hard to mix, but usually there's not as much down there. And things that live in the super high range, as I mentioned earlier, things like percussion, things like hi-hats, they're not competing with much. So it's much easier to mix those. A lot of times it's the sounds that live in the middle range. A lot of times where your vocals are going to be, where your melodies are going to be, or your chords are going to be. That's really where you're going to run into a lot of issues. So we can use EQs as a way to kind of like divide and conquer. So for example, if I have, let's see what this one sounds like. Man, we're just having all kinds of audio issues today. And all right, we got that guy and that guy. They're in slightly different frequency ranges, but they're going to include a lot of the same there's a lot of the same things going on here. So what we can do is we can kind of like de-emphasize the frequencies for one of them and then emphasize the other frequencies. And that way we can kind of like make things stand out a little bit more. So for something like this, where we have, this is sound number one, this is the lower one. And we have this one, which is the higher one. What I'm going to do on the higher one is de-emphasize this area here a little bit, and I'm going to emphasize this area here a little bit. Maybe make it a little more refined like that. A little more, something like that. And then on the other one, oh, did I just do it on the wrong one? Yeah, I did it on the wrong one. Sorry about that. Let's do this one here. So this is the correct one. I'm going to de-emphasize it a little bit in this area and emphasize it in this area. And on this one, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to emphasize it in this area a little bit and de-emphasize it in this area a little bit. And now when I play the two together, we can kind of like make it so they're competing with each other a little bit less. So that's going to be the other kind of EQing that I'm going to be doing. It's kind of like boosting things a little bit in one area, de-emphasizing another area, usually to kind of clear room for another sound that lives in a similar frequency range, and that way we can hear them a little bit better together. So those are the two ways I'm going to be using EQs primarily. Is number one, low cuts all over the place to get rid of unwanted frequencies, and then using little bits of boosting, little bits of cutting to help clear out room. The other major thing that I'm going to do when I'm approach my mixing is going to be panning. Panning is really, really powerful when it comes to mixing, and people always, it's like the hidden hero of mixing. And if you guys have any questions about either mixing or whatever, feel free just to let me know. So for example, once again, we have these two sounds here, and they're both, again, kind of in similar frequency ranges, kind of doing similar things. Right now, they're both coming right down the middle. Now, when I'm talking about like how sound is competing with other sounds in your song, I mean that in like a very literal sense. Like if you have two speakers, there's only so much each speaker can vibrate, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to shift one of these a little bit to one side and one a bit to the other, and that way they're vibrating in different ways, and you're kind of dividing up the workload here. So each speaker has to vibrate less, which hopefully should allow us to hear them a little clearer. And I don't recall if I've set up OBS to stream in stereo. So you may or may not be able to hear this or not. So hopefully you can. But if I take this guy and move it a little bit to this side, and then I take this guy and move a little bit to the other side, and then play them both at the same time, we're making the workload on each speaker a little bit less. Therefore, we can hear a little bit on each clearer, and they're not competing with each other as much anymore. So that's kind of the idea behind panning. We're spreading things out onto different speakers so that we can hear everything a little bit clearer, and on top of doing things like adjusting relative volumes and EQing to make sure that we can hear different frequencies all at the same time. When it comes to panning, there's not going to be a whole lot of like hard, fast rules for panning. There are a few things like your low end, you want it to be straight down the middle. So your kick drum and your sub, right down the middle. No panning needed whatsoever. Same thing with your vocals. Your main vocal layers are going to be right down the middle, pretty much always. If you're doing like little vocal harmonies or little other layers of vocals, you can pan them off a little bit to the side. Hold on, let me just catch up the chat real quick. Yeah, so username, you're actually correct here. So you'll see a lot of people talking about using utility versus using the actual volume faders on the tracks. And really what you want is you want to use the volume faders to be able to make things louder or quiet to adjust them relative to each other. If you would like to automate your volume, that's where you want to use the utility. So if you, in fact, I've already got one in here. So you see, I've already got a utility with the gain on it. I didn't really automate it. I just turned it up a little bit. But if I wanted this to do like a fade in, if you automate the volume for a fade in like this with the actual track volume, if I want to change this relative to other tracks, it overrides the automation temporarily until I reactivate it. So if you automate volume, that's a big no-no. So we can just delete that automation. So use this to control your volume relative to other tracks, and then use the utility to do volume automation to turn things up and down over time. Hopefully that makes sense. But yes, you're correct. Using the utilities is super important for fade ins, fade outs, adjustments like that over time. But I will use the actual volume faders. So if I want this to be louder relative to this, I can see them both at the same time, and I can adjust them up and down together to make sure I can hear the right amount of each one. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, I don't really see if there's a point for just not ever touching these volumes. Like I always use these volumes for adjusting things to be relative to other tracks. But in terms of panning, like I said, bass, vocals go right down the middle. Generally, your drums are going to be pretty close to the middle. I've heard arguments for keep your snare in the middle. Some people like to pan a snare off a tiny bit to one side or the other. Depends on you. Things like, I don't know, I think like the more important a sound, the closer to the center it is. So things like my pads and my chords oftentimes will be farther out to the side, whereas things like my melody will be closer towards the middle. But there's no right or wrong in terms of how far you go either direction. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll try to pair up sounds. So sounds like this and this that are kind of similar to each other. I'll pair them up and then pan them opposite each other. And that way my mix doesn't sound lopsided. One way to think about panning is going to be think about like when you see a band on stage, think about how that band is set up. Usually you have your drummer in the middle, and then you have your bassist off to one side a little bit, and you have guitarists off to either side, and you have your vocalist in the middle. The reason they're set up on the stage like that is that's how the album is mixed. That's how the sounds are spread out across the stereo field. So you can use that kind of as a guideline, especially if you're mixing a band or something like that. But you can also apply that same kind of logic to electronic music as well. But yeah, have fun with panning. People always underestimate how important panning is. And once you do a round of panning on your mix, all of a sudden you can hear everything way clearer. So those are going to be kind of like my 3 initial stages for mixing. Relative volumes first, a little bit of EQing, mostly low cuts on everything, not too worried about detailed EQing yet, and then a quick round of panning. If I need to add some compression, I might add a little bit of compression here and there. That kind of goes hand in hand with the relative volumes a little bit, but that's kind of like my first draft of mix. Just go in, crank all that out, and that's the rough draft of the mix. That makes sense? Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I think I'm just gonna have to make a whole video on just my mixing process and kind of go through it. Because I think a lot of people have different ideas about what mixing should look like. So there's no questions about that. The next stage of the process, once I've done my rough draft of my mix, is completely different. The next stage of all of my mixing is basically I'm going to open up like either Google Doc or like a note-taking app or whatever, and I'm going to listen to the entire song start to finish, starting at the very beginning, going all the way to the end. And as I listen to it, anything that sounds out of place, if anything is muffled or too quiet, I'm going to write it down. If anything is too loud, I'm going to write it down. If a transition doesn't, the volume doesn't transition smoothly the way I want it to, I'm going to write it down. Anything that I notice that is just not sounding the way I want it to do, I'm going to write it on my to-do list. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to check everything off the to-do list. I'm just going to go in, okay, the kick was too loud at bar 16, I'm going to turn it down a tiny bit. And then the snare needed a little bit of EQing starting around bar 42, I'm going to go and do that. And so I'm going to check everything off the checklist. And then once I do that, I'm going to do the exact same thing again. I'm going to listen to from the beginning of the song to the end, write down everything I hear, and then just go through the checklist and knock everything out. The reason I do it this way, and this is something I learned from a friend of mine who mixes professionally, where, you know, he has deadlines he needs to meet and he just needs to like be able to knock out a really solid mix really fast. The reason we do this is that the biggest issue with mixing you run into is you'll be listening to your mix and you'll be like, okay, I'm gonna turn this up by 2 decibels, and I'm turning it down by 1.5 decibels. And now I'm gonna turn it up by 0.7 decibels, and then back down by 0.6 decibels, and then back up a decibel, and then down 3 decibels. And you always change your mind. You just like, you end up just like turning things up, turning things down, EQ things, turn it off, mix, like you go down these rabbit holes where you just like, you get distracted by something. You'll start EQing one thing and you'll get distracted by a different sound, and then you'll like go down that rabbit hole, and next thing you know, it's 2 hours later and your mix sounds like garbage. And the best way I found to avoid that is just use the to-do list method. You go in, you listen to the entire song start to finish, you write down all the things you want to fix, check them off the list. And the idea is that each time you go through the checklist, each time you go through that process, you start hearing things you didn't hear before. You start noticing little tiny details. You start, getting really decisive about exactly where you want all your volumes to be and how you want your mix to sound. So by going through the checklist, it avoids, or it at least helps prevent getting in those situations where you are just stuck in a rabbit hole and you just have gone too deep down it and you're ruining your mix and you don't realize it because you haven't taken a moment to step back and listen to the entire song, to listen to the big picture of it. So I'll usually do that about an infinite amount of times. But once you do it 6, 7, 8 times, just do that repeat checklist process, you start to get a pretty solid, pretty polished mix. And it's the most efficient way by far I found of getting to a mix where I'm like, you know what, this is sounding pretty good. It's like, maybe it's not perfect yet, but I'm getting to the point where I'm feeling decent about it and can kind of start to understand where this mix is going and what it's going to sound like. So if I ever figure out this microphone situation, I will do that on stream sometime. I will probably, maybe for one of the Patreon only streams, try doing that as an experiment and see how it goes. And that way you can kind of see, like, you don't need to spend 20 plus hours on a mix. You can get a decent quality sounding mix in under 4 hours if you're paying attention and you're like, if you're sticking to a workflow that makes sense and you're staying focused. Because I definitely had mixes where I 2 hours made a mix, and then over the next 10 hours, I ruined the mix by always tweaking things and changing things and then screwing it up. So that's my kind of general advice, my general approach to mixing. Hopefully that's helpful for you guys. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to be doing it a lot in the very near future. This is going to be part of the 50 song challenge. It's going to be getting the mix and masters done within 1 week on top of producing a track. So I'm looking forward to dialing in my mixing workflow and streamlining it even more, and just like under sub 2 hour mix is what I'm going for. Like a sub 2 hour clean polished mix that I feel proud of. We'll see if I can do it. Right now it's 4 to 6 hours, I think, to get the mix that I want realistically. But that's why we practice, and that's why we're going to try to dial it in even more. All right, I feel like I've been ranting about mixing for a while. So number one, just like to check in with you guys, make sure that all makes sense. Hopefully that's helpful, as well as invite anybody else who may have questions about anything related to either mixing or otherwise. Feel free to toss those in the chat. And like, obviously it's a bit more complex than that. There's a bit more things I'm doing, but that's honestly a big chunk of what my mixes are made up of and what that sounds like. Everybody good? Chat's been real quiet, which makes me wonder if something's going wrong. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I'm gonna go ahead and get out of this project. Nice. Okay. Good to know, Emo. To know that you guys are taking all the knowledge I'm dropping on you and using it right away. Sweet. What else do you guys got questions about today? What else do you want to talk about? Dan, not really. I think there's only a couple situations where ordering effects, I think, really makes a big difference to me. The first major situation is going to be filters. Where you put your filters is going to make a big difference in a lot of situations. So if we, for example, let's just do like a wavetable, and then an auto filter, and then like a distortion, for example, do some overdrive. So the relationship between this overdrive and this auto filter makes a big difference, because if we have the distortion first and then the filter, we're not really, oh my God, why do I keep doing? All right. So distortion first and then filter, we're not getting any of the distortion because it's filtering it all at first. Whereas we are after, we are. So where you put your filters in your signal flow does make a big difference in a lot of situations. So that's one situation where I'd watch out for it. Most other effects, it's not going to make a huge difference either way, wherever you put them. The other big consideration is effects for effect's sake. So effects for just like fun, like reverbs, delays, distortion, phaser, flanger, chorus, all that kind of stuff, versus effects for utility. So effects for utility being like compressors, EQs, the actual utility, things that are less about kind of like altering the sound and more for just like cleaning or refining it. So I always like to make sure my utility effects go at the end of my signal flow. So let's keep the overdrive as my fun processing effect, and then I'm probably going to have like an EQ8 and a compressor at the end, and maybe utility. So my EQ8 and my compressor are going to be, like I said, more kind of utility, fixing things kind of effects. whereas my overdrive is going to be my for fun, make it sound cool. So I'm always going to put these guys at the end of my signal flow. That way I can process the sound in whatever way I want, and then I can refine the sound in a really refined way. Yeah, and then EQ first, then compressor, then versus compressor first, then EQ. This is a timeless argument that I've seen people come down on both sides of, and so I think there are legit arguments for either one. I personally, so basically in the situation here, we have compressor first. We are basically essentially turning things up. We're turning everything up, and then in this situation, we're turning some things down afterwards. Let's not clip it so hard. Versus in this situation where we're turning a few things down first and then turning all of it back up. There's, like I said, there's arguments for both. I don't think I have official position on it. Either way, I think it's totally fine. I think when in doubt, just swap them and see if you like it. Like, see if you can notice the difference between this versus this. They sound pretty similar, but not exactly the same. We're actually getting, it sounds like more low end this way. But yeah, it's kind of up to you. People will tell you one or the other. Try it out for yourself and see if you notice much difference there. I think for the most part, I'm going to be doing EQ first and then compressor, but I'm not tied to that. It's not set in stone. But these two together are always going to be after everything else. Yeah, but Emo, you're still going to get the attack and the release on the compressor, regardless of which order it's in. Like, you're still going to get that on either side. I guess the signal coming into the compressor first, I guess, won't have dips in frequencies or boost in frequencies. Yeah, I think it's kind of up to you. The other thing I'd like to point out that I didn't really mention earlier when it comes to EQing and mixing, or just EQing in general, is additive EQing versus subtractive EQing. There are different schools of thought on this as well, and different people who get on different sides of the fence. So subtractive EQing is obviously when you turn things down, and additive EQing is when you boost things. There are some schools of thought that are never, ever additive EQ. You only ever want to do subtractive EQing. There's some people like, do whatever you want. Boost things, cut things, doesn't matter. Go either direction with it. I kind of like to fall into the middle ground a little bit, where when you're doing subtractive EQing, go nuts with it. You can go as low as you want, and that's totally fine. But when you're doing additive EQing, be subtle with it. Like, don't do this, but like, this is okay. So usually if I'm doing any additive EQing, I'm never going above 6 decibels, almost never. But like 2 or 3 decibels is totally fine. Whereas with subtractive, you can go nuts with it and kind of put it wherever you want. So the way I like to think about it is subtractive EQing for clarity and additive EQing as like an effect, if that makes sense. I see a lot of people who have like EQ curves that look like this, or like something crazy like that. If you're doing this, why not just turn the volume up on the sound? Like, just turn the volume up somewhere. It's because that's essentially all you're really doing. So if you're doing a lot of additive EQing, or same the other way, I don't see this as much, but if you're doing something like this, why don't just turn the volume down by like 6 decibels, and you're getting basically the same thing. So that's why I tend to be fairly specific and fairly subtle with a lot of my EQing. It's like, this is not a EQ curve that you will most likely see in like any of my mixes, because it's just, number one, it's crazy. Number two, it is kind of like all over the place. So you want to be subtle with it. And if you have to do really extreme EQing like that, just turn up the volume. and that's going to be roughly the same thing. In fact, it'll probably sound better. Whereas like this might be more likely like a actual EQ curve that you might see in one of my mixes. But yeah, EQing. There's a lot of EQing is such like a simple concept, but there's like so much to learn about it. Sweet. Anybody else have any questions? Appreciate you guys having all the questions today. It's really, it makes these streams really kind of fly by. Thoughts, topics you guys want to get into? Let me know. But yeah, other than that, those kind of things, order of effects is not going to make a huge difference. And when in doubt, just try switching them around. Try rotating it and see if you're like, you know what, I like it better this way, or I like it better the other way. But for the most part, it's not going to make a huge difference. Cool. So, oh, happy birthday, email. How old are you today? That's awesome. I wish I had like a special cool thing I could do for your birthday. Yeah, I hope you guys are making some cool tracks. I cannot get over how cool the tracks you guys are sending me for the feedback streams have been. I'm like, I want to brag to people about it, but I don't know who else to brag to besides you guys. Oh, nice. Sweet. So I think just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, I'm going to hang out for a little bit longer in case anybody has any other questions or things, but I think we covered a lot of stuff today. I will most likely reiterate a lot of the mixing stuff in a mixing video that I will make at some point in the near future. I just gotta figure out how I want to kind of divide up that video into different subtopics. But for those of you guys who are not aware, you're obviously aware of the new stream schedule, but I'm doing a Patreon only stream tomorrow afternoon, same time, same place. If you guys are Patreon members, if you're not, go ahead and check that out. And then I'll also be back Wednesday for the song feedback stream. So that's what we got going on this week. And then I just filmed the video I'm going to be releasing on Thursday, and I'm really excited about it. And I think you guys will hopefully like it. Dan, so would you often automate the EQs? I honestly don't do a lot of EQ automation. And if I am going to be doing EQ automation, I'm probably just going to be using the auto filter. The auto filter is really nice because it's really easy to automate and like add a little bit of resonance or do whatever I need to do with it. So if I'm going to have like a filter that's going to like slowly open up, I might just use auto filter just to do that filter motion slowly going up. Though technically this could basically do the same thing. So have this start down here and automate this up, and it would functionally be the same thing as doing it this way. This is just nice because it's very kind of visual and does one thing. A lot of times with my EQs, I'll just kind of like set them and leave them wherever I want them to be. And that's kind of how I'll work with that. I won't do a lot of like, you know, this is gonna move over here for different parts of the song. Like usually it's like, okay, I figure out my EQ curve that sounds good, and then I'm just gonna leave it like that, and that's gonna be it. So that might be a personal preference thing more than anything else, but I like to use auto filter for motion and movement with filters, and I like to use the EQ8 for just kind of like, it sits there, gets rid of frequencies I don't want, and then there you are. Cool. Dan, I'm glad that was useful and helpful for you. Yeah, moving EQ can cause some phasing stuff, although I'm not too worried about it. So username is asking about panning. If you have an instrumental track where the melody is from one synth and there's nothing to balance it with, would I put it dead center? Sometimes, but not always. You don't need something on the other side to balance it out. And something I'd recommend try doing is like listen to some old Beatles records with like one earbud. You're missing like half the song because like panning was like the new cool technology back then. They're like people were like going nuts with panning. And so when you listen to the whole thing, it sounds like you can hear everything all at once in both ears. But if you take one out, you're actually missing a lot. So don't feel like you need to like one-to-one. If I move something over here, something else has to be over here. If I move something over here, something else has to be over here. If it's like a super minimal track where there's not a lot going on to it, maybe I'd leave it in the center. But usually I'll pan it off a little bit to either side. I think that's totally fine. So duplicating it can sometimes be a really great idea. However, when you duplicate it on the second layer, change it a little bit. I'll do this actually quite a bit. If I have one layer that I like, I'll duplicate it and then I'll add in some extra effects. Maybe I'll add in some extra delay or extra reverb, or I'll pitch it up an octave or down an octave, or I'll just like, I'll tweak it so it's not exactly the same thing. If you just have two layers that are exactly the same and opposite each other, it's not really doing a whole lot for you in terms of your mix and clearing space in your mix. But if they're different than each other, they say they're not happening exactly the same time, or again, you have different kinds of effects on them, then it actually will actually add a bunch. And I think that that can be a really cool way to create a more kind of organicness to a mix, is have the same layer doing different things on different sides, and then it's like it's not exactly even on each side, and that can actually work really well. But I would not recommend just duplicating and then just panning. That I think is going to still it's still taking up space on both of your speakers, and therefore not clearing a bunch of space in your mix, if that makes sense. But yeah, duplicating and then changing things and then panning them, I think is a great idea. And sweet. So yeah, that was a good stream. I think we covered a lot of stuff today. Like I said, I need to make a mix video eventually. That'll be coming real soon. Got a video about distortion coming on Thursday, and then I might do a video on remote collaboration next week. We'll see. We'll see if I can get the app to work, or the plugin to work. Cool. So I think I'm going to call it there for the stream today. Yeah, I agree with email. Grouping tracks can also help a lot with your mix, and that, especially if you're doing the sub mixing where you like mix all your drums first and all your bass and then all your synths or whatever. Grouping them can offer you a lot of different ways to process those things and deal with like chunks of tracks at a time. Sweet. So I think that's going to be it for today. Thank you guys for coming in and checking it out. If you are a Patreon member, I will see you tomorrow. And if you are not, I will probably see you on Wednesday for the song feedback stream. So have a good night, evening, afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. And yeah, I'll see you later. Have a good one.